What happens when your fairy tale wedding becomes your worst nightmare? Emily Carter thought she was living a dream, marrying billionaire heir Landon Hayes in New York's most exclusive wedding of the year. 400 elite guests, international media, coverage of Vera Wang dress worth more than most people's homes. But 30 minutes before walking down the aisle, she discovers a devastating letter that shatters everything. Then his dangerous older brother, Julian, appears with an impossible offer *, calling all love story lovers. Today's episode will melt your heart and maybe even bring a tear to your eye. Ready? Let's begin. *, the cathedral's Gothic arches stretched toward heaven like stone prayers. But Emily Carter felt abandoned by every god she'd ever believed in. 400 guests sat in mahogany pews, their whispers rising like incense through air thick with white roses and broken promises. The Vera Wang gown that had made her feel like royalty now felt like a costume for a play where she'd forgotten her lines. Miss Carter. The wedding coordinator's voice cracked like thin ice. We need to make a decision. Emily stared at the hotel stationery crumpled in her trembling hands. Landon's familiar scrawl had become foreign hieroglyphs spelling out her destruction. I'm not ready for marriage. You deserve someone better. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Behind the coordinator stood a figure that made Emily's breath catch. Julian Hayes emerged from the shadows of the alcove, his dark suit impeccable despite the chaos. His jaw carved from the same unforgiving stone as the cathedral walls. Where Landon was golden sunshine, Julian was winter midnight. Where her fiancé's charmed rooms full of people, his older brother commanded them with silence. The guests are asking questions, Julian said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came with being heir to a media empire. The photographers are getting restless. Emily watched him approach, noting how he moved like a predator. Even in this sacred space, she'd always been slightly afraid of Julian Hayes, though she could never articulate why. He'd been kind to her. The only family member who never made her feel like she was wearing borrowed clothes at their dinner table. But there was something dangerous in the way he watched the world, as if he could see through people's carefully constructed facades to the rot beneath. What do you suggest? Emily's voice came out stronger than she felt. Should I walk down? That all and marry the ghost of your brother? Julian's gray eyes swept over her, taking in the diamonds in her hair. The cathedral train that pooled around her feet like spilled moonlight, the mascara that hadn't yet started to run. For a moment, something flickered across his face that looked almost like hunger. No, he said finally. You shouldn't. The coordinator wrung her hands. Mr. Hayes, we need to tell them something. The mayor is out there. The archbishop is waiting. Channel 7 has a live feed. Then we tell them the truth. Julian stepped closer, and Emily caught the scent of his cologne, something dark and expensive that made her think of midnight storms. Sometimes the truth is the only thing that can save us. Emily laughed, a sound like breaking glass. The truth? That your golden boy brother decided to abandon his bride on international television? That I'm standing here in a dress that costs more than my parents' house, looking like the fool who actually believed in fairy tales? The truth, Julian said, his voice dropping lower, is that my brother is a coward who just gave me the best gift he's ever given anyone? The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Emily felt something shift in the space around them, some invisible line being crossed. She'd noticed how Julian looked at her during family dinners, caught the way his attention sharpened. When she entered a room, she'd told herself it was paranoia, projection, the natural wariness of someone who'd never belonged in their world. Now she wondered if she'd been lying to herself. What are you saying? She whispered. Julian reached out and touched her face, his thumb tracing the path where tears would fall if she let them. His skin was warm against hers, and she found herself leaning into the contact, despite every rational thought screaming at her to step away. I'm saying, he murmured, that you have a choice to make. You can walk out there and let them see you broken. Let my brother's cowardice define this moment. Or you can marry a Hayes who actually deserves you. The cathedral bells began to toll, their bronze voices echoing through stone and flesh and bone. Emily stared into Julian's eyes and saw something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. This wasn't rescue. This was something far more dangerous. "You're insane," she breathed. "Probably." His thumb was still against her cheek, his body close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "But I've wanted you since the moment Landon brought you home. I've spent 2 years watching him treat you like a pretty accessory. He could show off at parties. I've watched you dim yourself to fit into his world when you should have been burning it down." Emily's heart hammered against her ribs. This was wrong on every level she could imagine. Julian was her almost brother-in-law, the heir to the family empire, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness in business was legendary. He was also the most magnetic person she'd ever encountered, and the way he was looking at her made her feel like she was the only woman who'd ever existed. "The guests," she managed to say, "will get the wedding they came to see." Julian's smile was sharp as a blade, just not the one they expected. The coordinator made a strangled sound. "Mr. Hayes, we can't just substitute grooms. The paperwork, the licenses, the Archbishop won't." "The Archbishop," Julian said without taking his eyes off Emily, "has been on my family's payroll for 15 years. The paperwork can be handled. The only question is whether Emily Carter is brave enough to marry the right Hayes brother." Emily felt the world tilting around her, gravity shifting, until Julian became the only fixed point in a spinning universe. This was madness. This was disaster. This was probably the most honest thing anyone had offered her since she'd stepped into the Hayes family's golden cage. "Give me one good reason," she said. Julian leaned closer, his lips nearly brushing her ear. When he spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been desperation. "Because I've been in love with you since you laughed at my joke about modern art at that gallery opening. I've spent 2 years in hell watching my brother take for granted what I would kill to have." The confession hit Emily like a physical blow. She remembered that night, remembered laughing at something Julian had said about a particularly pretentious installation piece. She'd been surprised by his wit, his intelligence, the way he'd seemed. To actually see her instead of just looking at her. And Landon had appeared with champagne and charm, and Julian had melted back into the shadows like he always did. Emily. Julian's hand moved to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling. "In the diamonds that held her veil, marry me right now, in front of all of them. Show them what it looks like when someone chooses you instead of running from you." The cathedral doors creaked open in the distance, and Emily could hear the rustle of fabric as 400 guests turned to look toward the back of the church. They were expecting a bride. They were expecting a fairy tale. Emily stared into Julian's eyes and realized she was about to give them something much more dangerous than either. Emily's yes came out as barely a whisper, but Julian heard it like a gunshot in the sacred silence. His hands cupped her face with a tenderness that contradicted the predatory gleam in his eyes. And for a heartbeat she wondered if she was making the worst mistake of her life, or finally waking up from a 2-year dream that had turned into a nightmare. "Are you both completely insane?" The coordinator's voice cracked with hysteria. "This is a cathedral, not some Las Vegas chapel. Can't just swap out grooms like they're interchangeable parts." Julian turned toward the woman with the slow, deliberate movement of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Mrs. Morrison, you've coordinated 17 Hayes family weddings over the past decade. Your discretion and efficiency are legendary. Are you going to let that reputation crumble because of paperwork?" The coordinator's face cycled through several emotions before settling on resigned terror. "The marriage certificate will need to be amended. The Archbishop will need to be briefed. The media will need to be managed. Handle it." Julian's voice carried absolute authority, and Mrs. Morrison, this conversation never happened. As far as anyone knows, Julian Hayes was always the groom. Emily felt reality shifting around her like sand in an hourglass. Through the stone walls, she could hear the string quartet playing Pachelbel's Canon, the same piece that was supposed to herald her entrance as Landon's bride. Instead, it was becoming the soundtrack to the most reckless decision she'd ever made. "Your parents," she said suddenly, the thought hitting her like ice water. "Patricia and Richard will never accept this." Something dangerous flickered across Julian's features. My parents accepted Landon's choice to humiliate you in front of 400 people in the international media. They'll accept mine, to prevent that humiliation from becoming the Hayes family's legacy. The way he said it made Emily realize there were currents in the Hayes family dynamics that she'd never understood. Julian wasn't just the heir to the business empire. He was the one who cleaned up the messes, who made the hard decisions, who carried the weight of the family name while Landon played at being a prince. I need to tell my parents, Emily said, her mind racing through the implications. They're sitting out there expecting to watch me marry Landon. They mortgaged the diner to pay for the flowers alone. They're watching their daughter marry into one of the most powerful families in New York, Julian corrected. The name on the marriage certificate is just a technicality. The coordinator scurried away, muttering into her headset about emergency amendments and crisis management. Emily found herself alone with Julian in the alcove, the weight of her decision settling over her like snow. "Tell me why," she said. "Really tell me. Not the romantic speech about love at first sight. Tell me why you're willing to do this." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her face as if he were memorizing it. When he spoke, his voice held a rawness that she'd never heard from him before. "Because I've spent my entire life cleaning up Landon's messes, and I refuse to let his biggest mess be you." He stepped closer, his presence filling the small space. "Because you deserve better than being anyone's consolation prize or backup plan. Because I've watched you try to shrink yourself to fit into a world that was never worthy of you." Hand found hers, fingers intertwining with surprising gentleness. "And because I'm tired of pretending I don't want you so badly, it keeps me awake at night." The honesty in his voice made something clench deep in Emily's chest. She'd spent 2 years feeling like she was performing a role, playing the perfect girlfriend and then perfect fiancée to a man who treated her like a beautiful object he was proud to own. Julian was looking at her like she was a force of nature. He wanted to challenge. "This is crazy," she whispered, completely. His thumb traced across her knuckles. "But so is wearing a dress worth more than most people's cars to marry a man who couldn't even face you to end things." The Archbishop appeared in the doorway, his ceremonial robes rustling with urgency. Emily had met Archbishop Sullivan twice during wedding preparations. He was a kind man who'd seemed genuinely invested in her happiness. Now he looked like he'd aged a decade in the past hour. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, "I understand there's been a change in circumstances. You could say that." "Emily's." The voice came out steadier than she felt. "The documentation has been adjusted. If you're certain about this decision, we can proceed. However, I feel compelled to ask if you're acting of your own free will, given the unusual nature of the situation." Emily felt Julian's hand tighten almost imperceptibly around hers. She looked up at him, noting the way his jaw was clenched. The careful control he was maintaining over whatever emotions were running beneath his composed surface. "I'm marrying the man I want to marry," she said, and realized as the words left her mouth that they were true. Julian Hayes was dangerous, complicated, possibly destructive. He was also the only person in the past 2 years who'd seen her clearly. Enough to know she was drowning in Landon's fairy tale. The Archbishop nodded slowly. "Then we should proceed quickly. The guests are becoming restless, and I understand there are media concerns to consider." Emily's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced down to see Landon's name on the screen, and her stomach dropped. The message preview showed only the first few words. "Emily, I know you must hate me, but I need you to understand." Julian's eyes followed hers to the phone. Without a word, he reached over and turned it off, slipping it into his jacket pocket. "Not today," he said quietly. "Whatever he has to say can wait until after you're married to someone who actually wants to be there." Emily felt something inside her chest crack open at the simple conviction in his voice. Landon's text had been another attempt to manage her, to control the narrative even from whatever hole he'd crawled into. Julian was offering her the chance to write her own story. "Okay," she said, "let's do this." Julian's smile was sharp and triumphant. He leaned down and brushed his lips against her forehead, the gesture somehow more intimate than a kiss. "Mrs. Morrison has briefed the wedding party," the Archbishop said. "They're ready to proceed as planned. The processional will begin in 2 minutes." Emily took a deep breath, feeling the corset of her dress constrict around her ribs. Minutes, she would walk down that aisle toward a man she barely knew, but who seemed to understand her. Better than the fiancé who's abandoned her. In 2 minutes, she would become a Hayes through marriage to the brother who'd always watched her from the shadows. Emily. Julian's voice stopped her as she started toward the door. Once we do this, there's no going back. I'm not Landon. Won't let you go. The warning in his tone should have terrified her. Instead, it made her pulse race with something that felt dangerously like anticipation. She turned back to him. Noting how the cathedral light streaming through stained glass windows turned his dark hair almost blue, how his gray eyes seemed to hold storms. Good, she said, and meant it. Wedding march began to play, and Emily Carter walked toward her new life with a man who promised to be nothing like the fairy tale she'd thought she wanted. The wedding reception at the Plaza Hotel ballroom felt like a fever dream wrapped in champagne and crystal. Emily sat at the head table, her wedding ring catching the light from a dozen chandeliers. Watching 400 guests celebrate a marriage that had been orchestrated in the span of an hour. The same guests who had come to witness her humiliation were now toasting her triumph, though none of them understood exactly what had transpired. Julian's hand rested on the small of her back as he spoke with the mayor's wife, his touch both possessive and protective. Every few minutes, Emily caught glimpses of Patricia Hayes across the ballroom, her mother-in-law's face a masterpiece of controlled fury. Richard Hayes had managed the situation with the cold efficiency of a man who'd built an empire on crisis management. But Emily could see the calculation behind his congratulatory smile. You're thinking too hard. Julian's voice was low against. Her ear meant only for her. They can see it on your face. I'm trying to figure out if I just married my savior or the devil himself. Emily replied, keeping her voice equally quiet. Julian's laugh was dark velvet. Can't I be both? The question made something coil tight in Emily's stomach. She'd been studying her new husband throughout the evening, cataloging the differences between Julian and Landon that went far deeper than appearance. Where Landon had been charming but shallow, Julian operated in layers of complexity that made her feel like she was constantly trying to solve a puzzle. Where Landon had wanted to show her off like a prize, Julian seemed to be claiming her like territory. Mrs. Hayes. The voice belonged to Patricia, who had finally made her way to the head table. Julian's mother was a study in controlled elegance, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. I wonder if I might have a word with my new daughter-in-law. Emily felt Julian tense beside her, but she rose gracefully, of course. Patricia led her to a quiet corner of the ballroom, away from the photographers and society reporters who were still trying to piece together the day's events. The older woman's composure never wavered, but Emily could feel the rage radiating from her like heat from a furnace. That was quite a performance, Patricia said conversationally. Tell me, dear, how long have you and Julian been planning this little substitution? The accusation hit Emily like a slap. We weren't planning anything. Your son Landon left me. At the altar, Julian offered me a way to salvage some dignity from the situation. Julian has always been protective of strays. Patricia's smile never faltered. It's admirable, really, though it can lead to poor decision-making. I assume you understand that this marriage is temporary. It's a face-saving measure. When the media attention dies down, you'll quietly divorce and receive a generous settlement. For your trouble, Emily stared at the woman who had just casually dismantled her new reality with surgical precision. Is that what Julian told you? Julian tells me very little, but he's a practical man. He knows the difference between rescue and romance. Patricia adjusted her pearl necklace with hands that were perfectly steady. You seem like a lovely girl, Emily, but you're not Hayes material. Landon's infatuation was understandable but temporary. Julian's gallantry is admirable but misguided. The words stung because Emily had been thinking similar things herself. She'd felt like an outsider in the Hayes world from the beginning, had always been aware that she was playing a role she didn't quite understand. But something in Patricia's tone made her spine straighten with defiance. Has it occurred to you, Emily said carefully, that maybe your sons know what they want better than you do? Patricia's laugh was like breaking glass. My dear, I've been managing Hayes family interests for 35 years. I know exactly what my sons want, what they need, and what's best for the family legacy. Julian is the heir to a business empire worth billions of dollars. His marriage isn't a romantic decision. It's a strategic alliance. Then why didn't you stop the ceremony? Because the alternative was watching my family become a laughingstock in the international media. Patricia stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. But make no mistake, dear. This arrangement is temporary. Julian will realize his mistake soon enough, and when he does, I suggest you make the transition as painless as possible for everyone involved. Emily felt something cold settle in her chest. She looked across the ballroom at Julian, who was watching their conversation with sharp eyes. Had he really married her out of some misguided sense of chivalry? Is Patricia right about this being nothing more than elaborate damage control? I see I've given you something to think about. Patricia's smile was triumphant. Enjoy the reception, dear. It may be the only one you get. Emily walked back to the head table on unsteady legs, her mind reeling with implications. Julian rose as she approached, his hand immediately finding her elbow. What did she say too? You. His voice was carefully controlled, but Emily could hear the steel beneath it. Nothing important. The lie came easily, but Julian's eyes narrowed slightly. He knew her better than she'd realized. Emily. Her father appeared at her side, his face flushed with champagne and happiness. Your mother and I wanted to thank you again for letting us be part of this. We know it's not the wedding you originally planned, but Julian seems like a good man. Emily forced a smile. Her parents had been so relieved that their daughter wasn't facing public humiliation that they'd accepted the groom's substitution without question. They were simple people who believed in love, conquering all obstacles, and she couldn't bear to burden them with her growing doubts. Dance with me, Julian, said suddenly, extending his hand. It wasn't a request. Emily allowed him to lead her to the dance floor, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes watching their first dance as husband and wife. Julian pulled her close, one hand at her waist, the other cradling her hand against his chest. They moved together with surprising synchronicity, as if they'd been dancing together for years instead of hours. Talk to me, Julian said quietly. I can see the wheels turning in that beautiful head of yours. Emily looked up at him, noting the concern in his gray eyes, the way his jaw was set with tension. He was worried about her, she realized. Actually, worried not just managing an inconvenient situation. Your mother thinks this marriage is temporary, Emily said carefully. A face-saving measure until the scandal dies down. Julian's hand tightened on her waist, his steps never faltering. My mother thinks a lot of things. Most of them are wrong. Are they wrong about this? Julian spun her expertly, pulling her back against him with controlled force. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I didn't marry you to save face. Emily, I married you because I couldn't stand the thought of watching you walk away broken by my coward of a brother. His eyes locked with hers, intense and unwavering. I married you because I've been half in love with you since the day we met. And today gave me the excuse I needed to stop pretending otherwise. The honesty in his voice made Emily's chest tight. She wanted to believe him, but Patricia's words echoed in her mind like poison. The Hayes family operated on levels of strategy and manipulation that she was only beginning to understand. What happens when the media attention dies down? She asked. When this stops being a crisis that needs managing. Julian's smile was sharp and possessive. Then we see what kind of marriage we can build when no one's watching. The song ended, but Julian didn't release her. Instead, he leaned down and kissed her, slow and deliberate, in front of 400 guests and a dozen cameras. It was a claiming, a statement, a promise of things Emily wasn't sure she was ready to understand. When they broke apart, Emily saw something in Julian's eyes that made her pulse race with equal parts excitement and terror. Whatever game she'd agreed to play by marrying him, the rules were more complex than she'd imagined. And she was beginning to suspect that Julian Hayes never played a game he didn't intend to win. 3 weeks later, Emily discovered that her marriage was built on a lie that would destroy everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and the man who shared her bed. The Hayes penthouse had become both sanctuary and prison. 40 floors, Above Manhattan, where Emily could see the entire city spreading out like a map of possibilities. She wasn't sure she deserved to explore. Julian had given her a studio space in the south wing, floored-ceiling windows that caught morning light and scattered it across canvases that were finally beginning to show traces of her authentic voice again. She was painting when she heard the argument. Julian's voice carried through the marble halls with an edge she'd never heard before, sharp enough to cut glass. Emily set down her brush, her heart beginning to race with the instinctive recognition of danger. She'd learned to read Julian's moods over the past 3 weeks, had become attuned to the subtle shifts that indicated when the controlled exterior was beginning to crack. This wasn't the agreement. The voice belonged to Patricia Hayes, cold. With fury, you were supposed to manage the situation, not complicate it. Emily moved closer to the studio door, her bare feet silent on Italian marble. She knew she shouldn't eavesdrop, but something in the tone made her pulse quicken with dread. "The situation is managed," Julian replied, his voice carrying the authority that made boardroom executives flinch. "The media has moved on to other scandals. The family reputation is intact. The family reputation is compromised by your ridiculous attachment to that girl." Patricia's voice dripped with disdain. This was supposed to be temporary damage control, not a real marriage. Emily's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She pressed closer to the door, her hand braced against the frame for support. "Watch yourself, Mother. Emily is my wife. Emily is a convenient solution to a problem that Landon created." Patricia's laugh was like breaking glass. "Don't tell me you've actually convinced yourself this is real. The arrangement was simple. Marry the girl. Let the media frenzy die down, then quietly divorce her with a generous settlement. Instead, you're acting like a lovesick teenager."
"Act the arrangement?"
Julian's voice went dangerously quiet. "Remind me of the details." Emily felt the floor tilting beneath her feet. There had been an arrangement, an actual plan, she pressed, her hand to her mouth to keep from making a sound as the truth crashed over her like a tsunami. "You know perfectly well what we agreed to," Patricia continued. "When Landon called from whatever hole he'd crawled into, we had 45 minutes. To prevent a media disaster, you suggested the substitution. I agreed with the understanding that it was purely temporary, a way to save face until we could clean up the mess properly," Landon called. Julian's voice was flat, emotionless. "When exactly did my dear brother call?" "Don't play games with me, Julian. He called you first, obviously. When he couldn't reach you, he called me. 20 minutes before the ceremony was supposed to begin." Emily's legs gave out. She slid down the marble wall until she was sitting on the floor, her wedding ring catching the light from the crystal chandelier overhead. 20 minutes before the ceremony. Which meant that when Julian had appeared in that alcove, when he'd made his passionate speech about wanting her, when he'd convinced her to marry him, he'd already known that Landon was gone. He'd already known, and he'd let her believe it was spontaneous. He'd let her believe it was real. "I see." Julian's voice carried a note of something that might have been resignation or relief. "And what did Landon say when he called me?" "Begged you to handle the situation. To protect Emily from the humiliation, said you'd always been better at cleaning up his messes." Patricia's tone softened slightly. She did brilliantly. "But this fantasy needs to end, Julian. The girl has served her purpose." Emily closed her eyes, feeling tears slip down her cheeks. Landon had asked Julian to protect her. Julian had married her not out of love or desire, but because his brother had asked him to handle an inconvenient situation. She was a mess to be cleaned up, a problem to be solved, a woman to be managed. "You're right," Julian said finally. "The fantasy does need to end." The words felt like physical blows. Emily struggled to her feet, her hands shaking as she wiped tears from her face. She needed to get out of here, needed to think, needed to figure out how she'd been so spectacularly stupid. "I'm glad you're finally seeing reason," Patricia's voice carried satisfaction. "I'll have the lawyers draw up the divorce papers, something discreet, citing irreconcilable differences. We can make the settlement generous enough to insure her." Silence. "No." Julian's voice cut through his mother's planning like a blade. "There won't be any divorce papers." Emily froze halfway across the studio, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Julian, Don't be ridiculous. This arrangement has served its purpose. The arrangement is over, Julian said, his voice carrying a finality that made Emily's breath catch. But the marriage isn't. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that I meant every word I said to her in that cathedral. Julian's voice roughened with emotion. I'm talking about the fact that watching her paint in the morning, light makes me believe in things I thought were fairy tales. I'm talking about the fact that she's the first person in my life who sees me as more than just the heir to clean up everyone else's mistakes. Emily felt her heart cracking open in her chest. The words were everything she'd wanted to hear, but they came too late, built on a foundation of deception that she couldn't ignore. You started this as damage control, Julian continued, but it became real the moment I kissed her. It became real when she laughed at my terrible jokes over breakfast. It became real when she fell asleep reading in my study and I realized I never wanted to sleep in a bed without her in it. Julian, Patricia's voice carried warning. I love her, Mother, not because Landon asked me to protect her, not because it was convenient, but because Emily Carter Hayes is the most extraordinary person I've ever met, and I'll be damned if I let your machinations destroy the best thing that's ever happened to me. Emily pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart breaking and mending simultaneously. Julian loved her. He'd let her believe their marriage was spontaneous when it had been calculated, had let her think she was his choice when she'd been his responsibility. This is disaster, Patricia hissed. That girl is not suitable for this family. She doesn't understand our world, our responsibilities. She'll be a liability. She understands more than you think. Julian's voice went cold, and she's stronger than any of us gave her credit for. Emily heard footsteps approaching the studio and panic flared in her chest. She couldn't face Julian right now. Couldn't. Pretend she hadn't heard everything. She moved quickly toward the service door that led to the back stairs, her bare feet silent on marble. She made it to the stairwell just as Julian's voice called her name, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She needed air, space, time to process the revelation that her marriage was both more real and more artificial than she'd ever imagined. She sat on a concrete step in the emergency stairwell, her silk dress torn from her flight, her feet bleeding from the rough stairs. In her hand, she still wore the wedding ring that Julian had placed there with such reverence 3 weeks ago. She'd thought he'd married her because he wanted her. Instead, he'd married her because his brother had asked him to handle a situation. The fact that he'd grown to love her afterward didn't erase the lie at the foundation of their relationship. Emily Hayes stared at her wedding ring and realized she had no idea who she really was anymore. Emily didn't come home. Julian found her 3 days later in the studio apartment above her parents' diner in Queens, painting with a fury that had transformed canvases into windows of raw emotion. Her latest piece showed a woman drowning in white. Silken diamonds, while dark figures watched from gilded balconies above. It was magnificent and heartbreaking and absolutely true. You're going to ruin your hands if you keep gripping that brush like a weapon, Julian said from the doorway. Emily didn't turn around. She'd been expecting him, had known he would find her eventually. The Hayes family had resources that made hiding impossible, and Julian had never been the type to let go of something he wanted. Your mother must be relieved, Emily said, adding, another violent stroke of black to the drowning woman's hair. The unsuitable wife has removed herself from the equation. Very tidy. Julian stepped into the small space, and Emily was acutely aware of how his custom suit looked against the shabby walls, how his presence filled the room like expensive cologne in a discount store. He didn't belong here, and they both knew it.
I
Didn't come here to take you back to the penthouse, he said quietly. Emily finally turned, noting the exhaustion in his face. The way his usually perfect appearance showed signs of strain. Then why did you come? To tell you the truth. All of it, even the parts that might make you hate me. Emily set down her brush and faced him fully. She was wearing paint-stained jeans and one of her father's old diner t-shirts. Her hair twisted into a messy knot with a paintbrush. She looked nothing like the sophisticated woman who'd graced society pages for the past month, and something in Julian's expression suggested he found her more beautiful now than ever. I already know the truth, she said. Landon called. You agreed to handle the situation. You married me because your brother asked you to clean up his mess. That's not the truth. Julian stepped closer, his gray eyes intense with something that looked like desperation. That's what happened, but it's not the truth. Emily crossed her arms, her wedding ring catching the afternoon light streaming through the small window. Explain the difference. The difference is that when Landon called, he didn't ask me to marry you. He asked me to make sure you were okay, to help you handle the media fallout. So the marriage was my idea. Emily felt her heart skip a beat, but she forced her expression to remain neutral. Your idea to solve a problem? It's my idea to keep you? Julian's voice roughened with emotion. Landon called me 20 minutes before the ceremony, panicked and guilty and asking me to make sure you didn't get destroyed by the scandal. I hung up on him and stood in my hotel room staring at the wall, thinking about you walking down that aisle to marry the wrong brother. Julian moved closer, and Emily caught the scent that had become familiar over their weeks together, dark and expensive and uniquely him. I'd spent 2 years watching you try to fit into a world that didn't deserve you, watching you dim your light to match Landon's shallow brightness, and suddenly I had 20 minutes to figure out how to save you from a humiliation you didn't deserve and claim what I'd wanted since the moment we met. So you orchestrated the whole thing. Emily's voice came out steadier than she felt. The passionate speech about love at first sight, the spontaneous proposal, all of it was calculated. The proposal was calculated. Julian's hands clenched. At his sides, the love was real. It had been real for 2 years, Emily. Every family dinner where I watched you laugh at Landon's stories. Every charity event where you tried so hard to fit in. Every moment I spent pretending I didn't want to steal you away from my own brother. Emily studied his face, looking for signs of deception. Julian had always been harder to read than Landon, but she'd learned to recognize the subtle tells that indicated when his controlled exterior was cracking. You lied to me, she said simply. Yes, the honesty in his admission surprised her. She'd expected excuses, justifications, the kind of smooth manipulation that came naturally to men in his position. You let me believe it was spontaneous? You were rescuing me out of some noble impulse. I was rescuing you, just not the way you thought. Julian ran a hand through his dark hair, disturbing its usual perfect order. I was rescuing you from my brother's cowardice, from my family's expectations, from a marriage that would have slowly suffocated everything authentic about you, trapping me in a different kind of marriage instead. Yes. Julian's smile was sharp and self-deprecating. A marriage to a man who loves you so completely it terrifies him. A marriage where you can paint pictures that burn down the world instead of pretty landscapes that match the decor. A marriage where someone finally sees you clearly enough to. No, you're drowning and pulls you out instead of holding you under. Emily felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. You should have told me. From the beginning, you should have told me about Landon's call. You have married me if you'd known? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Emily thought about it honestly, remembering the woman she'd been in that cathedral alcove. Broken and humiliated and desperate for any lifeline that would preserve her dignity. I don't know, she admitted. I couldn't risk it. Julian's voice dropped to a whisper. I couldn't risk losing the only chance I'd ever have to make you mine. So I lied by omission, and I convinced myself it was protecting you, when really I was protecting myself. Emily walked to the window, looking down at the street where her father was sweeping the sidewalk in front of the diner. Normal life, simple life, the kind of existence she'd left behind when she'd entered Julian's world of marble and crystal and beautiful lies. Your mother wants the marriage annulled, she said without turning around. My mother wants a lot of things she's not going to get. Julian's voice carried steel, including a say in who I love. The media attention has died down. The crisis has been managed. There's no reason for you to stay married to someone who doesn't fit into your world. There's every reason. Julian moved behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Emily, look at me. She turned reluctantly, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her breath catch. I want you to fit into my world, he said fiercely. I want you to remake it. I want you to paint truth on all our pretty lies, to laugh at our ridiculous pretensions, to show us what authentic looks like when we've forgotten how to be real. His hands framed her face with a tenderness that contradicted the desperation in his voice. I want to wake up every morning and watch you create something beautiful. I want to fight with you about art and politics and whether the coffee is too strong. I want to grow old with someone who challenges me, who sees through my carefully constructed facade to whatever's worth loving underneath. Emily felt herself wavering, caught between the hurt of his deception and the pull of his honesty. How do I know this isn't just another manipulation? Another way to manage an inconvenient situation? Julian was quiet for a long moment, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. When he spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability she'd never heard from him before, because I'm giving you the choice I never gave you before. The real choice, with all the facts. He stepped back, his hands falling to his sides. I love you, Emily. Not because it's convenient, not because you need rescuing, but because you're extraordinary and brave and more beautiful when you're angry than most people are when they're trying their hardest. Julian reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Emily's heart stopped as he opened it, revealing not a ring, but a key. This is the key to the gallery space on Fifth Avenue that's been sitting empty for 6 months. He said it's yours if you want it. But no strings, no conditions, no expectations. Whether you come back to me or not, whether you stay married to me or not, it's yours. Emily stared at the key, understanding flooding through her. The gallery had been one of her dreams, something she'd mentioned offhandedly during one of their late-night conversations. She'd never expected Julian to remember, much less act on. Why? She whispered. Because I want you to have everything you've ever dreamed of, even if I'm not part of it. Julian's smile was sad and genuine. Because I love you enough to let you go if that's what makes you happy. Emily looked at the key, then at Julian, then at the paintings scattered around her makeshift studio. Pictures of drowning women and gilded cages and dark figures who might be saviors or captors depending on the light. I'm not the same person you married, she said finally. Good. Julian's smile turned sharper, more like the man she'd fallen in love with. I never wanted to marry someone who would stay the same. Emily took the key from the velvet box, its weight substantial in her palm. A gallery of her own, a space to create without compromise, the dream she'd thought was impossible when she was struggling to pay rent above her parents' diner. If I take this, she said carefully, if I go back with you, things will be different. I won't be the accommodating wife who smiles at your mother's dinner parties and pretends not to notice. When she talks about me like I'm not in the room, I'm counting on it. I won't shrink myself to fit into your world anymore. I'll remake it or burn it down, and I won't apologize for either choice. Julian's laugh was dark and delighted. Now you sound like the woman I fell in love with. Emily studied his face, looking for any sign of reservation or doubt. Instead, she found anticipation, hunger, the look of a man who was finally getting exactly what he wanted. One more question, she said. If Landon came back tomorrow, if he wanted me back, what would you do? Julian's expression went cold and dangerous. The predator she'd always sensed beneath his civilized exterior finally showing its teeth. I'd remind my dear brother that he gave up the right to want you the moment he walked out of that cathedral, Julian said quietly. And then I'd make sure he understood that you belong to me now in every way that matters. The possessiveness in his voice should have alarmed her. Instead, it made heat coil low in her stomach, made her remember why she'd been drawn to Julian's darkness even when she'd been engaged to his golden brother. Emily closed her fingers around the gallery. Kian made her choice. Take me home, she said. Julian's smile was triumphant and relieved, and so full of love that it took her breath away. He pulled her against him, his kiss fierce and claiming, and full of promises she was finally ready to let him keep. When they broke apart, Emily looked around the small studio one last time. The paintings would come with her, reminders of the woman who'd been broken and rebuilt herself stronger. The gallery key was warm in her palm, symbol of dreams that were finally within reach. She was Emily Hayes now. It's not because circumstances had forced the name on her, but because she'd chosen it, chosen him, chosen a future where she could be extraordinary instead of accommodating, where she could burn bright instead of dimming her light for anyone else's comfort. Julian took her hand, and they walked out of the small apartment together, leaving behind the girl who'd needed rescuing and taking with them the woman who'd learned to save herself. 6 months later, the Hayes Gallery opened to critical acclaim, featuring the work of an artist whose paintings of drowning women and gilded cages spoke to everyone who'd ever felt trapped by beautiful lies. Emily Hayes stood in her gallery wearing red instead of white, paint stains on her hands instead of diamonds in her hair, accepting congratulations from a crowd that included her parents, her best friend Jessica, and even a grudgingly impressed Patricia Hayes. Julian watched from across the room, his gray eyes full of pride and possessiveness and the kind of love that was dangerous enough to remake worlds. When their eyes met, Emily smiled, remembering the woman she'd been in that cathedral 3 years ago. Was desperate for rescue. She'd found something better than rescue in the end. She'd found herself. * subscribe for more intense stories of love, betrayal, and redemption. Like if this story gave you chills, comment your thoughts below. The end.